Going to talk about the latest Ukraine peace deal, which has been put forward and supposedly accepted, according to reports coming from the White House. Insiders within the government who are reporting to CBS. But let's go through a little bit of the backstory of the past week, the events that have led up to this, what could be a historic moment where Russia and Ukraine, mediated by the United States, might be able to actually end the war. So, first of all, last week we had the announcement that Trump had put forward this 28-point Ukraine peace plan, which was reported in full. This copy was leaked and obtained by the Associated Press, and it immediately caused a lot of controversy because a lot of people said that it was favoring the Russians. It was supposedly drafted, I believe it was drafted, by Steve Witkoff in collaboration with Jared Kushner, the American negotiators, and a Kremlin official, Kirill Dmitriev, one of Putin's right-hand men. The agreement was detailed to the AP by an unnamed senior US official. There does seem, regarding this leak, to be a number of agents behind the scenes, actors behind the scenes, who are trying to leak as much as possible to the press, possibly as a way of stymieing peace negotiations, but we don't know for certain right now. It does not obligate the US or European allies to intervene on Ukraine's behalf, although it says that they would determine the measures necessary to restore security. The most important points were laid out as that the Ukraine would not be allowed to join NATO. EU membership would be on the table, though. And elections must be held in Ukraine within 100 days. This goes to the idea that people have been pointing to for a while, that it appears that Vance and Trump would like, and the Americans in general, would like Zelensky out of office as soon as possible once the war is over. And Ukraine's army would have to be capped at 600,000 troops, compared to its current 880,000 troops. And some frozen Russian assets, I believe $100 billion worth, would go towards rebuilding Ukraine, while sanctions on Russia would be lifted and Moscow and Washington would enter in a series of long-term economic arrangements, most of which seem engineered in such a way to make sure that the United States can profit massively over reconstruction in the affected areas where there's been infrastructure and other kind of damage done. Obviously, the one that most people are complaining about is the cap to the Ukrainian army, the lack of direct NATO intervention, and the fact that a number of the oblasts, all of the currently occupied oblasts, are said to be you just have to give them up. Russia takes them. A lot of people are angry at the idea that Russia has essentially won in this scenario, which is why people were saying that this particular peace agreement, which, as far as we know, is not the one that has been accepted, although it may have been, they were saying that this one was supporting Russia. This one favoured Russia too much. So more in depth, some of the points that were made in this one, which was number 12, the powerful global package of measures to rebuild Ukraine, including, but not limited to, the creation of a Ukraine Development Fund to invest in fast-growing industries, including technology, data centers, and artificial intelligence. The United States would cooperate with Ukraine to jointly rebuild, develop, modernize, and operate Ukraine's gas infrastructure, including pipelines and storage facilities. Joint efforts to rehabilitate war-affected areas for the restoration, reconstruction, and modernization of cities and residential areas, infrastructure development, and extraction of minerals and natural resources. The World Bank will develop a special financing package to accelerate these efforts. Again, so the United States' heavy involvement in this, as well as Russia's reintegration into the global economy in point 13, and then the point 14, that being the frozen funds being used, $100 billion in frozen Russian assets invested in US-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine, wherein the US will receive 50% of the profits from this venture. So with the US wrapping so much of itself up in this whole deal, people say that this one was overly favorable to the Russians. To me, this seems like the US raiding Ukraine. I understand why, but they have definitely put this together in such a way that the US financially benefits as much as possible from this.
From my perspective, this I don't know if I'd use this word, because if you are financing someone during a war, if you are supporting an ally during a war, then most probably, you will have some benefits after the war ends.
Of course.
It's not, it was never no strings attached. Well, there was this mistaken idea that the US helps its allies without strings attached. No, there are strings attached.
Of course.
And they only did that for Stalin.
Yeah, but I mean, of course. But also on the other bit, it doesn't seem to me to be that bad, if that from my perspective. If they have helped Ukraine, but also the EU has helped Ukraine, and they get something in return and they help build and rebuild Ukraine, they are assisting the effort of, building something. It's not that they only take and haven't given.
Some would argue one of the only reasons that the US was getting Ukraine to fight this war in the first place was in the hopes that they could have all of these strings attached at the other end. Some would argue that they were doing it to purely weaken Russia and fight the proxy war with Russia. Others may say that this was a combination of factors. Speaking of which, the idea of potential further vassalization for Ukraine as a buffer state between Russia and the rest of Europe, supported by America. One of the most interesting points that I didn't see a lot of people mentioning here was point 20, which goes into the idea of social engineering, as is so popular within American empire vassal states. That being, both countries undertake to implement educational programs in schools and society aimed at promoting understanding and tolerance of different cultures and eliminating racism and prejudice. The Ukraine will adopt EU rules on religious tolerance and the protection of linguistic minorities. Both countries will agree to abolish all discriminatory measures and guarantee the rights of Ukrainian Russian media and education. All Nazi ideology and activities must be rejected and prohibited, which I assume is based almost entirely around the notorious Azov battalion. But this broad language about racism and prejudice, and the knowledge that Ukraine has lost a lot of young men at this, and there has been a long-running joke amongst some that in the end Ukraine may have been fighting for Drag Queen Story Hour and endless Pymalians. This makes me worry that the joke might have been correct. Now, I can understand, and there are revisions that can be made, but this feels very much an imposition of American multicultural ideas upon an Eastern European framework.
I'm a bit hesitant to say that this is the case. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just going to suspend judgment, because racism isn't just
something like this is absolutely warranted. The way that America's vassals have developed.
The reason I'm saying this is because racism and prejudice isn't just white, black, black, white. We can talk about all sorts of minorities that could be in the region, and all sorts of ethnicities that see each other in sorts of different ways. And this could be a sort of attempt to mediate between them, because there are Russians in Ukraine, there are Ukrainians in Russia, and even more ethnicities. So there is a kind of attempt to create reconciliation. I don't think that Eastern Europe suffers so much from the kind of migration that we're criticizing on a daily basis. But it is a possibility. It is a possibility.
It doesn't, but it could.
Yeah.
Also,
and it will be used, something like this, the decimation to Ukraine's infrastructure and population, in the same way that we are now told narratives in the UK about how the Blitz necessitated the Windrush generation and migration coming over to rebuild the country, and we are now told that they were essential to rebuilding the country. I see this as that same wedge issue.
I agree with that. That's what I was just about to say. And also to your point, Stelios, about the sort of like particular nature of race and ethnicity in Eastern Europe, of course. That may well be true, were it that Russia and Ukraine were left on their own to create their own educational programs for those purposes. But because, as Harry says here, this seems to be an imposition top-down by the United States.
How could there not be? No, I'm not saying that there isn't. I'm just saying that right now we're talking about two superpowers and Ukraine, and they are trying to mediate on a leadership position for the next day. And if you're helping someone throughout a war and you're going to be there when they rebuild, it's not that much to ask for some benefit in the rebuilding process.
Oh no, I understand that. I'm talking about the idea.
Of course, it could backfire.
I'm talking about the ideological imposition that I'm reading into this, which I think is not that difficult. But you can also it can also, and I do agree that this is a likelihood that this is an attempt to prevent resurgent nationalisms within minority groups in the area who might split away, break away, trying to prevent something like this happening in the future, in the same way that all of these oblasts in the east of Ukraine were, before this war broke out, claimed by Russia as breakaway sovereign states that were only recognized by the Russian Federation.
But there are some steps towards aligning Ukraine with the US, because when you are a country under the sphere of influence of a superpower, that superpower wants you to have essentially the system that they have, which I think is what you're talking about.
Well, yes, I just see that system as a terrible system that destroys your country and culture.
I mean,
and again, for me, the
pros and cons.
The interesting thing is, I don't think there's much pro to being wrapped into the cultural ideology of the gay, as it's known, the global American empire. I think it's an acidic.
I mean, also
ideology.
Being under
it's the ideology that
of
we've
Putin's
been.
Russia wouldn't be particularly good for them also.
I know. I just think it's a bad imposition. And I'm just saying that's the whole ideology that we've been arguing against for years on this podcast. So I'm not going to say that it would be a good thing for Ukraine, who have done so much to try to carve themselves out their own identity, including fighting this war, to then have that subsumed by a global superpower forcing their ideology on top of it. But that might just be me reading into it. The interesting thing is that when the European member states put forward a counter proposal, because again, they said that this was far too favorable towards Russia, that particular point was changed, and instead of using very loaded ideological language like racism, prejudice, they changed that point to more succinctly say, that there will not be any action taken against linguistic minorities in your territories, which I think is actually a much better and less divisive way of wording that kind of agreement when you're talking about an area like Eastern Europe.
If anything, it surprises me with how careful Europe have been on that one. You'd expect the roles to be reversed and that Washington would be more careful and Europe would still, because Europe are in their minds still far more woke than Washington are.
I mean, you might think so. I would disagree. But either way, those whole points may not even matter in the first place, because after this, there were further negotiations taken in Switzerland on Sunday, led by the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Zelensky's Chief of Staff Andriy Yermak. I apologize if I'm pronouncing these names wrong. The plan was substantially revised, only down to 19 points rather than 28. From the reports that I was looking at, I couldn't find anything that specified which points were changed, which may have been revised, which were taken out entirely. So we can just say that, assumedly, Ukraine would have tried to change this more in their own favor, perhaps some concessions with NATO troops on the ground, because Keir Starmer has said explicitly that no peace can happen without some kind of NATO peace force on the ground in the transitionary period, which only makes sense.
I think that they may be trying to play good cop, bad cop, and I think most probably my reading of the situation is that Trump and the European leaders have agreed behind closed doors. That's a speculation that they're going to have more hawkish language, and Trump is going to tell Putin, "Listen to these guys. I'm going to be more partial to you. Let's end this."
Well, he's trying to just get negotiations going through with both sides, because these kinds of negotiations the original points were done with Russia, Now Ukraine has their chance to look over it, and it's many are pointing out art of the deal. Art of the deal, make something bombastic and out there and a bit unreasonable so that anything that you work back from will appear much more reasonable in comparison. So Ukraine had their chance to look over things, and then we had the surprise news on Tuesday, just yesterday, stating that Ukraine, this was an exclusive for CBS, agreed to a peace proposal. We do not know the specifics of that peace proposal, if it was this new 19-point revised peace policy that they had negotiated supposedly on Sunday. This was an update from a US official who spoke to CBS News saying that Ukraine's government had agreed to a peace deal brokered by the Trump administration to stop Russia's nearly 4-year assault. The American official and Ukraine's national security advisor Rustem Umerov said a common understanding on a proposal had been reached, with details still to be worked out. Umerov voiced optimism that Ukrainian President Zelensky could travel to Washington before the end of November to finalize an agreement. The Ukrainians have agreed to a peace deal, the US official told CBS News. There are some minor details to be sorted out, but they have agreed to a peace deal, so reinforcing that there. Some more information here. The US and Ukraine representatives hold talks in Geneva over the weekend. Ukraine and European allies, this is just going over. US Army Secretary, there we go, Dan Driscoll met Russian officials for several hours in Abu Dhabi today. That was yesterday. I think they are still speaking today to discuss the latest developments following the talks with Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to travel to Washington before the end of this month. Keir Starmer will convene a meeting of 36 nations in the coalition of the willing to discuss the peace process and plans for a peacekeeping force to be deployed. And again, there is talk now of potentially Russia having to make concessions as well. So we'll see how it goes. Donald Trump is currently saying that Russia is making concessions and that Kiev is happy with how talks are progressing. That's as of this morning. Speaking to reporters on Air Force One as he flew out to Florida, Trump said that we're making progress on a deal and said he would be willing to meet with both Vladimir Putin and Zelensky once they are close to an agreement. The announced deadline of Thursday on Thanksgiving is no longer in place. The 28-point peace plan was supposedly just a map. Asked if Ukraine had been asked to hand over too much territory, Trump suggested that over the next couple of months, that might be gotten by Russia anyway. Moscow's concerns are a promise to stop fighting, and they don't take any more land, he said. When questioned on this, I saw the footage of him basically saying, well, you know, we want to stop the fighting. If Ukraine doesn't want them to take that land, they could just keep fighting and win it back, which is obviously just his backhanded way of saying they've lost.
Yes.
They've lost. That is territory that they have lost. Now is just making sure that we get all of the arrangements in place so that they don't lose any more territory and so that this doesn't break out again too soon into the future. So we'll see how it goes. Maybe this will be something that can last. Maybe Eastern Europe will stay peaceful forevermore. Or maybe things will not end up that way. But we'll see. We'll see how things go. I just hope that the fighting can end. It's been almost 4 years now. Too many people have died, and Ukraine doesn't hope to, outside of just full-on pure intervention from EU states and the US, Ukraine cannot hope to take that land back. So better to end the fighting now than to keep people dying.
If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.